I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the director of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy Program at the Indiana CTSI, and we are very pleased to present our next TREATS talk, Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics talk. And today we're very lucky to have our BSAP faculty member, Andrew Brightman. Dr. Brightman is a long-standing now, I can say, after a few years. He's our Purdue representative on BSAP, and he does a lot of work for us with engineering, with Purdue, and other areas through BSAP, and we're thrilled to have him here today. He's the Associate Professor of Engineering Practice at the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering at Purdue University. And he will speak to us today on a topic I'll let him introduce. It's a topic we've talked about within BSAP over the years, and we're happy to have this shortish introduction to the topic for those who face this question in their own research about when does, for example, education become research? And so I'll hand this over now to Dr. Brightman. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for everybody joining us. I wanted to bring up this topic. It's of interest, particularly to us in engineering, biomedical engineering, where we run student design projects as a core element of teaching our engineers about designing new medical devices. And I'm hoping that there will be some crossover relevance to other kinds of projects where students get involved, either as drivers or some form of participation. The questions we're going to address really are about the student projects themselves, and particularly when the students are doing the research on themselves, which was an interesting situation that's come up in discussions at a number of points. So let me just get into a few slides to give you some background here. The next generations of medical devices and medical technologies are emerging even in classrooms today, where we're teaching our engineering students how to do the design process, but a number of them take those very same projects on to commercialization. The way that we set up our teaching of medical device design is they start as juniors in the biomedical engineering program. They contact clinical people, industry, medical device industry folks, and say, what are the problems that are not being addressed or need to be solved, and that we might be able to address. And we try to encourage them, and this is just not at Purdue, but across the country in biomedical engineering, encourage them to find real-world problems to attempt to solve. Granted that maybe only one or two of those out of each biomedical engineering program turn out to be something of real use, they do pose some ethical challenges, and particularly for this human subjects research. So here's an example from the University of Texas at San Antonio. The student team's developing a vein finder technology. I don't know this team specifically, but they received a grant funding. They obviously, from NSF, they had to put together a proposal. There's going to be a requirement for them to publish and present, and certainly even to get to this stage, they've probably presented at some national level, regional or national level competitions. And it's not clear. I don't know this particular system, but it's very likely that their testing of the technology was on other students or even on themselves. I'm more familiar with this team, which is from Purdue. It was a team that last year submitted their design project to the NIH. The NIH NIBIB had a partnership with an agency, VentureWell, that supports biomedical engineering design of medical devices. And so they came up with a solution to a problem which was getting pediatric sputum samples for looking for pediatric tuberculosis, particularly in developing countries. And the way they designed this was a kind of a sampling tube that could, the idea is that it would pass through the digestive system, but it would be triggered in the stomach and collect stomach samples that could then pass through, be captured, and be tested. This was not tested, has not yet been tested on on any human subjects, but the system was tested preclinically, and they presented at both a business plan competition and at this national competition, and were first place winners, and are taking this forward into commercialization currently. But that neither of those projects are particularly focused on invasive technologies. We don't typically allow the students to do sort of invasive technologies at this stage, but they can do proof of concept. But some of the issues that come up as they're preparing their projects and imagining what they might be doing, and then as they're actually in their senior year developing the devices, and part of that development is to test the prototypes, are some questions that have arisen over the years. For example, if they're testing with human subjects and they decide to test them on themselves or their classmates, are those students considered human subjects? And does that testing protocol need IRB oversight? And a major part of that is this is in a course, but if they're intending to do something more public with the data and they're collecting it systematically, is the human subjects testing they're doing really actually fall under research, or is it feasibility? Is it device testing? We'll talk about that issue. Another issue that's come up is the students are doing it in a course, and in order to get a good grade and to satisfy the requirements for graduation, these seniors often need to collect human subjects data for their project. And then if they're doing it on themselves, where's the line around consent with under coercion? Because there's clearly some benefits that they might lose if they didn't collect the data that they needed. So we'll talk about that. And then the final piece is maybe less of a bioethics direct principle question, but it certainly plays into making some decisions because the students have a very limited time to work on these proposals. And what we're finding is if they even sense that there might need to be some IRB protocol approval, and they know that those can take months, they just basically abandon that project and say, we'll do something else, or we'll only do this aspect of it, a very limited component, which again limits their ability to test real world problems in some cases. And so we don't want to delay or even derail projects that could have real impact. So how can we determine early if it's going to need approval, particularly during that previous year in their junior year, third year, when they're coming up with the projects? Can we have some way to help them determine that and get a protocol approved for testing before they go into their senior year? And that's maybe a more logistics problem, but it does, I think, speak to the sort of negative side of that is sometimes protocols are not submitted for review, and people decide that it's not human subjects research because it would be inconvenient to determine that. And so I think that's where this plays, from my perspective, into the decision-making process. And I'll just say my role as assistant head for academic affairs in our particular program, and I know this is true in other biomedical engineering programs, is I'm maybe the only one who's paying a lot of attention to these bioethics, human subjects issues. The faculty members who are so focused on innovation can get a little bit of a narrow focus and want to see technology develop. And we go back and forth about whether something should be considered human subjects research or not. And I think there's a lack of clarity. And this is the point of which I came to back to the T-Rex for a consult on it a couple of years ago to get some insights. And so what I'm presenting is some insights from that consult and my experience, and hopefully it will generate a conversation that I can learn more about this, and it could spread to other sorts of projects. So here's a case that I thought would be useful to think about as we're going through some of these discussions. So new wearable sensor technologies been developed, uses acoustical sensors to monitor human vital signs. A college student team proposes to use a tiny acoustic sensor attached to a thin polymer film that will stick to the body and can stay there. The device would have the ability to recognize, for example, sounds of heart valves, opening and closing, recording electromyograms, muscles, heart muscles particularly, would be able to potentially detect heart murmurs, blood clots, or any sorts of obstructions in the flow. So there'd be flow recognition, and it could even detect some level of spoken language, words, because it's recording, in the chest and close to the vocal cords. So to get the A grade, the 5 students want to test this device that they're developing with some 24/7 recordings, maybe for a week or so or two, and they're going to test it on themselves and then submit that data to a design competition and publish it in a student research journal. So some of the issues that come up are, is this human subjects research? Are the students themselves human subjects? It's a class. It's being presented in a design competition and a student research journal. Is that generalizable knowledge? Is it really research-based? So let's go to, and then the other issue where other students consenting under coercion because they're trying to get an A in the course, and collecting this data is really important to proving that they've got a functional device, that they've done their engineering well. So here's some ethical things to think about. Seems the common rule states, all researchers have to follow the guidelines, CFR 45 Part 46, the Protection of Human Subjects Studies. And that includes when the researchers themselves are the subjects of the research. That does require IRB pre-approval. So it sort of points back to, yes, the students, if they're testing on themselves, we have to determine first, is this actual research? But if it is, then they would likely be considered human subjects. It doesn't say anything about whether this is in a course or not. And most of the reading and review I've seen doesn't create a distinction there, but later we'll see that some universities do. The Purdue IRB, Human Subjects Protection documents suggest that faculty, students, and staff, any of those that are involved in any sort of human subjects research are required to comply. So equally stating that students are not outside of this requirement. And later we'll even discuss at the end, I'd like to discuss the fact that maybe as students who are inexperienced researchers, they might require even higher level of supervision and oversight because of their inexperience, generating a higher risk. So keep that in mind. The key definitions from Part 46, research is systematic investigation, which includes testing and evaluation, but it's particularly designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So there's some key things, as most of you are familiar with, that the systematic investigation is what needs to be really understood, and the contribution to generalizable knowledge. The second component is human subject, a living individual about whom an investigator, again, whether it's a professional or student, is conducting research. So if you determine it's research and you've got a human subject who's alive and you're collecting data through some sort of intervention or interaction with the individual, or you're collecting identifiable private information. So a couple of things that come up are, so they're testing a device in this case, a sensor that's intended to collect human vital signs and information about humans. It potentially could even collect some sort of identifiable private information if it's recording speech, or if it's identified who the test subjects are in the data collection. But the question is, on some of these cases, maybe not this particular one, is when is the research about the device and when is it about the subjects themselves? Are we just getting some information that says whether this device is working or not and how this technology is functioning, and that's could be considered generalizable knowledge. It could be published and others could build on that information, but it's generalizable about the device and not about the subjects. How many subjects do you need to test with the device for it to be generalizable? If you only have 5 students, is that a generalizable population? What could we learn from that? And then how might the data be collected in a way that is not attributed in any way to individuals? So, for example, if the students collected their recordings individually, they each wore it, and then they wore a device, and then they uploaded it to a anonymous database so that no one, including them, they could only know their own data and they didn't know the other 4 subjects' data, then there would really be in a sense, there's a possibility of creating an anonymous database that could be used to evaluate the technology, but not be generalizable about the subjects. So those are some questions that we argue about or discuss. A couple of other things about private information. This is the point is it includes behaviors as well as particular functions of the human subject. It's private in the sense that the person can reasonably expect that it's not going to be made public, or it's not individually identifiable. So we were just talking about the possibility to create databases of information that might be completely anonymous and then therefore not individually identifiable. In this case, obviously, a recording of someone's vital signs, the students believe that it's going to be made public if they have consented to that. The question is, at what level of identification of themselves would that involve? Interestingly, other folks have commented differently, and so it's, while they're looking at the common rule or the CFR, here's an example, the Society for Science and the Public, which is supporting clear understandings for students' research projects. They have a whole section on student research projects. They suggested some studies involving humans are exempt. In this case, one of their lists are student designs, inventions, prototypes, and computer applications or engineering design projects in which the student is the only person testing the invention, prototype, and the testing does not pose any health or safety hazard. So they make a distinction, which I actually haven't found that distinction anywhere else, but it's interesting that some published. But I think that exemption would be more. My anecdotal information is that many biomedical engineering or other engineering programs would sort of take that position. If the students are testing on themselves and it's in a class, even if they're going to publish it later, it's not really research. It's not enough data to be generalizable, even though they're going to publish it. It doesn't propose any particular health or safety hazard. Visualizing a vein in someone's arm, that's maybe no more dangerous than taking their picture, or taking a photograph, or recording them on a video camera while they're speaking. Wearing an acoustical monitor, I think that runs another step level. I mean, what if you do, in fact, detect some heart murmurs or blood clots, or you're recording private information? I think that bumps the level of risk up a little bit, even if the device itself is determined its malfunction would not harm anyone. It would simply just fail to record something. But we do have devices which, in fact, if they were to explode or to short circuit, could potentially, not necessarily short circuit, but to have an electrical failure of some sort, could potentially burn the skin or cause, if they were in the ear or somewhere else, could cause a problem. So some of the projects do have health or safety hazards. Obviously, they would not fall under this exemption. Interestingly, back to the Part 46, minimal risk, probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater than, in and of themselves, than ordinarily encountered in daily life. That's the standard definition. Or in the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So we just want to keep that in mind when we're sort of saying what is minimal risk, what is no health or safety hazards. And doing risk assessments is an important piece of the engineering design process. We want them to understand both the risk to the subjects and the risks of failures. They do design failure analysis to see how the device might fail and what could happen. Interestingly, Purdue IRB does give some examples of research activities and some non-research activities, which, while their determination of human subjects research I felt was pretty clear, I found this list confusing to some degree. So they are saying some examples of research activities, obviously formal investigations and experiments, but including also pilot or feasibility projects, exploratory studies, student independent studies, directed projects or dissertations, and some demonstration activities. I'm not sure how a demonstration activity becomes research generalizable knowledge. They don't explain it. That's exactly what they say. And then they also have some non-research, which include classroom activities that teach research methodologies or simulate research activities. So I think our engineering design courses fall into that realm. They're classroom activities, they're teaching research methodologies, they're simulating research activities. Some of them turn out to be actually research. And so it's not clear from this definition where to draw the line. I don't know if that's helpful. Activities required for quality assessment or quality improvement, not meant to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So sometimes we are determining functionality, quality of data, quality or improving a device. And then the third one raises this question: if you're doing interviews of individuals, so collecting individual responses, but the questions focus on the things and not on the people, again, then it's not considered human subjects research. So I'll keep going through this, but please interrupt me if you want to have questions or dialogue about it. We can come back to it at the end, I guess, but I'll keep going through. So some of the ethical issues, yes, go ahead.
On the last slide, where you could just go a little bit further into what you think simulate research activities means. That one just seems really interesting to me.
Yes, and I think it's where you get a very blurry line. I'm imagining, and where I've seen it used in teaching, myself and by other faculty members, is you would give the students a set of data that's already been collected, already been used, and you ask them to do some sort of analysis. Or you give them a device that's been tested and you say, you collect the data and you see. Or you say, design, this, one of the things we do is design an experiment that would help determine the answer to a problem that you've now learned about this material property or this device, and you want to know something new about it. How would you create some new information? And when you get to that point, if they're creating new information and they're collecting that from individuals and it's human subjects, you really have to ask, okay, when does the data you collect get to a publishable quality? Are they going to generate figures and graphs and put it in their report? Yes. Are they going to put it into public knowledge and say this is going to be accepted by peer review? Maybe, maybe not. We've had several cases where the courses that are simulating research, actually, they publish a paper from the course and it goes into a peer-reviewed journal.
We're gonna have John Bowman is gonna comment. He's gonna commentate. Because actually, Andrew and I both have some hard questions about generalizability,
yes,
and about the idea of systematic investigation. I'd like to postpone it to the end
to
finish. And then I think, unless you really want to go now, John, I really want to ask these hard questions that are changing now with the new common rule, I think, too. Although it'll be good guidance both for us and for people watching, and these questions are great.
But I find interesting the notion of simulate research activities. So I've been involved in the IRB review of studies of physicians and medical students to test knowledge gaining through the use of a simulated body, and so forth. However, we did get one time they wanted to test the quality of the simulated entity itself, not of the operators learning skills, techniques. And we said that's not human subject research because, as you pointed out before, the data being collected is not about the human. And so that fits in there a lot, and I think that might be something we'll come back to a lot when we go and ask about a specific activity. Is it a simulated research activity on the simulator versus on the learning or experience of using it?
What you're saying also will have implications for all device testing, right? The research is on the device, not on the people wearing the device. Does that come into play when deciding whether the IRB is involved, whether it's human subject research at all? And that's much broader than just the question of how students testing devices will face it. But I'd love to hear more, John. Why don't we do that at the end? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Great, outstanding.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So I want to go back. We talked about sort of the first two. Are they considered human subjects? Students testing on themselves in a class setting? I think yes. The question is it research? If it is, then they would be considered human subjects. The third one is, are they consenting under coercion here? And I know less about this. I would say that a recent paper came out in the Asian Bioethics Review was a study of medical students participating in research, and it was a partial meta-analysis, cross-sectional. No, it wasn't a meta-analysis. Sorry, that was a different one. But it was a cross-sectional. They interviewed hundreds of medical students, and they determined that a large number of them were by the form that was determined that used to measure coercion, that a large number, a third of them, would be considered to have participated under coercion because their medical school professor or a significant person conducting the research was requiring them to do so, and they did it against their own choice. So the general requirements for informed consent are very clear. Legally effective informed consent includes sufficient opportunity to consider whether or not to participate and minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. And then a further component, the statement that participation is voluntary and that refusal to participate will involve no penalty or loss of benefits to which the subject is otherwise entitled, and so both of these have to be true. The subject may discontinue participation at any time without penalty or loss of benefits. One way we get around this with student projects is we say, if you don't want to collect the data on yourself, then you have to find a willing participant somewhere else who will consent, and likely that would be someone who's not in the class, so they aren't influenced by the grade. The opportunity to do that, the numbers of students or other people who are willing to participate in this goes way down, and so then they're, in a sense, if they're going to collect the data, they have a very limited number of participants that they can recruit.
I'm laughing at them.
Yeah, so
they have to coerce someone else.
So they have to coerce someone else, right, in some other way.
This issue of coercion is interesting because you not only need you need to have a situation where a reasonable person might otherwise decide not to do it, and so there has to be some type of and does there need to be some type of negative consequence to it? It's so the first one where you're looking for the vein, there's no harm to it. It's not something that a rational person would otherwise choose not to do. The listening device is sort of interesting because if it can pick up voice and you're wearing it continuously, you may not want to have people pick up your private conversations.
Right. Or if you have particular heart issues.
Yeah.
And you may not want other people to know that you have
So
heart
there may
issues.
be some privacy, so I don't know, so thinking about, like, with these really minimal risk studies, I always like to push back a little bit about this idea of coercion, because it has to be a situation, but this is sort of like, I mean, the vein thing is sort of like, yeah, why not? I mean, there's not a lot of risk, there's not a lot of benefit, I mean, so is it?
And I do think that one of the questions is the students are very highly motivated internally to do well, and does that overrule the sense of coercion? Because they've signed up for this course, they've chosen to be a biomedical engineer. This is a huge benefit to them. So next to a minimal risk.
If you're looking at something that's really minimal risk, there's no loss of privacy. I mean, you could talk about maybe it's undue influence, maybe not, that if they need to do it. I mean, could you set...
Right. So I like to raise this question with the faculty who are running the senior design projects to just be aware that a student choosing for some reason or for any reason to not participate should be considered and not penalized for this. I think that's where we draw the attention, and that there might be an issue that they don't know about.
And thinking about, like, I guess the contextual pieces of what's the project and what does it involve.
I mean, I think we also have to be careful that just because there's ethical issues, just because there's risk, just because there's safety, that doesn't make it an IRB issue.
Exactly.
And there are other organizations and agencies that either exist within the university or that may be created on an ad hoc basis to address those, rather than inappropriately, in my opinion, mission creep the IRB into those other safety and risk factors.
I agree, John, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But the the idea that there could be safety issues that are not human subjects research issues, we do have laboratory safety controls. The students have to be checked out. We do determine what the risk is of danger to themselves, even if it's not human subjects research. So we've got another system in place that protects the students from their own enthusiasm and inexperience. But one other piece that comes into this coercion is when the project the student's working on has originated in a PI's lab and they have federal funding and they're trying to meet a deadline and they've involved the student's project as part of collecting their own data. We cross into a zone where I feel like the faculty then are at some risk of unintentional or intentional coercion, and they have to be made aware of when the students, because if they don't include those students as human subjects, they can't use that data, right? So then they have to make sure they have full consent on their own IRB approved protocol, right? Because then the student project becomes part of their research.
I mean, faculty conducting research among their students is a norm, not unusual.
Right.
And there are any number of standard processes in order to ensure that it occurs in a way that is both ethically and regulatorily sound.
But if they're the PI and they've not identified perhaps that they're also the senior design project faculty, and they're using some of the students that they have approved for students, but some of those students are in a class now that are being graded. I think we have to navigate that as an extra level of concern. The other issue is about expedited review. Some folks say, well, this is just expedited review, it's student projects. The language is that research activities, so if we determine this is research and it's human subjects, but they're research activities that present no more than minimal risk, involve only procedures in these, I think there's 7 categories. It doesn't have an age or student exemption there. But the one that seems to be called on is this collection of data through non-invasive procedures, which is what we're often doing in these from human subjects. But these are procedures routinely employed in clinical practice and medical devices that are already cleared and approved for marketing. So these are not investigational devices. These are not newly developed devices. So the caveat there that studies intended to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of a medical device are not generally eligible for expedited review. So this gets back to this idea, can we get through the IRB review quickly with an expedited review? I think our general response is if it's determined to be human subjects research, it's not expedited review. So,
I guess it depends on the device and how it's being used.
right. If it's a student-designed device and it's being used in a research setting, I think this would argue that it can't be expedited review. They've got to look at the full ethical profile, the safety, the risk to the students.
Does the FDA have separate regulations for devices? Like, how does that,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah, they have a separate review as well.
And does their, like, 21 CFR 25, whatever it is?
Yes, right, 812.
Does it, does it differ from this, or does it not differ from this?
There are some differences, and I can't tell you off the top of my
but
head.
not for medical. If I was thinking specifically for medical devices.
There are some differences specific to medical devices, and whether they're in investigational device exemption or whether they're in a clearance protocol for that sort of approval or clearance, or if they're full new device a pre-market approval. So at this stage, we're not doing the level of data collection that would be used in an FDA submission. So none of this data could be used in an FDA submission. But if they go to the next step and they want to collect that data in that way, then they have other requirements in terms of how the data is collected that would.
So the FDA regulations wouldn't apply at this really preliminary level?
Typically not at this stage, because FDA is mostly looking at post-research evaluation, right? So you've completed your research, you've set a design, now you're going to develop a product. So it's in the clinical study, sometimes preclinical, but at that point you've got a device that you've determined from this sort of research that it does this, that, and the other thing, and now you're going through the process.
I have a very specific question for John. John, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. This has to do with a term of art, I suspect. So the student with the acoustic sensor who is just trying to show that it works by wearing it for 5 days, is that you cannot, if you decide it was human subject research for other reasons, though we'll get back to that. Let's say it was, and you wanted to know whether you could do it for expedited. This seems to indicate, because one of the things they'll be assessing will be that whether it hurts safety and whether it actually records the sounds. I guess that could be counted as safety and effectiveness. On the other hand, you might say those terms of evaluating safety and effectiveness would apply only to a more formal study involving real stopping rules and measures of effectiveness for a medically important outcome. Or do you think, John, this is meant, if you can say you don't know, or it's ambiguous, is this meant more really any use of that device?
I'd say the devil's in the details in that, but there are it's not infrequent that we have a study that really is minimal risk, but it doesn't fit any of the minimal risk categories. So it has to go to a convened committee. It goes to convened committee for initial approval, and then they, at that same meeting, determine it now meets expedited category 9, which means a study that was originally reviewed by a full committee, but in the future can be reviewed by expedited. It's minimal risk, but it doesn't fit a category. And I don't know, I can't answer right now whether the new common rule changes that or not sufficiently.
Thank you. So one of the things at that last point was, can we get an early sort of review to determine if it's human subject research, and are there some ways to do that early in the design process when the students are thinking about a project? So our Purdue Human Subject Protection, Research Protection has a form. It's the Determination of Human Subjects Research. It's a short form. It comes from the University of Washington materials. Developed a little bit with Purdue. But it basically asks, go through the steps. Is it systematic data collection? Is it an investigation? Is it contributing to generalizable knowledge. So it determines first in research, then it determines human subjects. Are the people are you collecting from humans? Are they alive? Is it identifiable data? Is it private information, et cetera? So you go through these categories. It includes, Mary, the FDA categories on there for devices that have been cleared or approved, and so they want to know that as well. So we ask the students to use that as a first step when they're planning their testing. So they in the spring of their junior year, when they're thinking about a project, if they're planning their testing, which we ask them to think about it ahead. Of course, they don't even have a device or know what the device is sometimes at that point, so they just have a problem they're trying to solve with some projected solutions. So it's hard to come up with actual, what are we going to actually do as a test? But we ask them to do this. And then the other thing we use is sort of an in-course quick check that they can use at any particular point, because sometimes they get down the road and they say, oh, we need to test this on a human, and they haven't gotten any approval. So we ask them, okay, if you're going to test it on a human, the answer to one is yes. Will the data be collected directly about the person? So this is that question of, is it about the device or about the person? We ask them to try to determine that clearly. Are you going to use this data in some sort of tables, figures, graphs? Are you going to publish this or present it? Are you going to take it on to, other than your report for the course, is it going to go into the student research journal or into a larger journal, peer-reviewed journal? Not that the student research journals are peer-reviewed as well, but the standard research journal. Are you going to take it to a design competition and publish it publicly? And then the fifth and perhaps critical piece is there any risk of harm to anyone? What's your harm risk assessment here, including physical, psychological, relational, privacy, that sort of thing? So this is not official, but it's just the quick check that we ask the students to alert us and alert the faculty member, and then it can ultimately bump up to me, and we can bump it up to the IRB and say, here are the answers we have. Do you think we need to submit this as a protocol? Because we're not trying to make extra work for people, but we also don't want to put the students or the projects at risk. So the last piece are here's a few published articles. And interestingly, there's some very different opinions in the literature right now about how to handle this. Everything from some very specific details, Pritchard's work on what actually is generalizable knowledge, and when can you say that this is data that you're collecting just as feasibility, and it's not really needs the human subject research categorization. Then there's the folks like Doyle and Wilkinson or Edwards, I guess, who argue back and forth, like student projects most likely don't result in generalizable knowledge, so it's sort of a waste of everyone's time to put it through a full review. We should get a student review board that will specifically review student projects, and then they can recommend if it goes to the next level or not. So it's sort of a pre-screening. Whereas Edwards says, no, look, these are inexperienced researchers. If this is research, even if it doesn't result in the outcomes that you want because they made mistakes, there's still a risk. There's humans. It's intended to develop generalizable knowledge, and so it's putting human subjects at risk, and it should be reviewed with even more scrutiny. I think the last one. The point is that maybe a little bit cynical, but sort of like we don't expect students to publish anything of any value, so we shouldn't even let them do human subjects research. We shouldn't call it that. We shouldn't let them do it. We should give them, So I don't know that many people, and I may be overgeneralizing that particular view, but I don't think many people would take a stance where we shouldn't let students have the experience of learning. That's just how they get there. And there's not a big difference between our students who are seniors and a few months later who are working at a company actually doing this work, live. And if they haven't had a chance to make some mistakes along the way, we think we've not turned out well prepared.
Or the IRB IRB review would not be required in that company.
It would not be reviewed, right? But we want them to understand what that process is and what human subjects research
Do we
is all about.
want them to understand what the IRB process is, or do we want them to understand responsible conduct of research and the ethical processes, which are not necessarily the same?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, we have a million questions that
Great.
we're all holding on to. So who wants to go first? Well, I'll start up. So on this, can you back up one slide?
Mm-hmm.
So will the data collected be directly about the persons in any way? This is actually a big question for me. So first, if I'm a student and I want to avoid having to worry about the IRB, I don't want to avoid doing ethical research, but I want to sort of solve this IRB problem. If I make my data de-identified, I collected, five of us wear the sensor. When I put that in the computer, I do not assign any individualized data to it. It's person A, B, C, and D, E. There's no even key to go back to who A, B, C, and D, and E was. I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
It's just my class. I did it for a week.
Mm-hmm.
Each of us did it for a week. So would that, as far as you know, would that help or hurt the question of is it directly about the person in any way? The data was collected from a person, so in that sense it's about the person. There is a heart tracing for me for the week, but I have no way of readily going back to me, so it's not really about me at all. That's the small question, whether de-identification matters. The bigger question is the thing I think I'm asked John to help me on, because I think about this a lot in our de-identified work, is some other work. So, when you interview a warden at a prison to find out how the prison runs, as part of a research study where you're collecting information about prisons, that's not human subjects research because it's not about the warden. He's giving you information. You could say there's a direct analogy there with a device, right? You're using a device to measure heart rates, but it's not about the heart rates. We're not trying to see whether we can diagnose AFib in patients with AFib. We actually want to see if the device basically works. Does that have anything to do with human subjects issues here about whether it's human subjects research, or is this just, it is human subjects research? We are collecting data about people with devices strapped to their body. And Peter, you're overthinking this to say that's not, it's like interviewing a warden. I was like, I should answer that.
I think then you might not be collecting particularly information about them, but you are engaged in an intervention and having them do something different than they normally would do. So that might be where it crosses the line.
I feel like
the warden is on the phone. He wouldn't normally be on the phone.
No, that's a bit different.
Okay.
That's a bit different, I think, because it's not quite the same. The new common rule also makes a very big deal about journalism, about oral history, literary and legal research are not human subjects research. And I think what they're trying to do is sort of redirect our attention a little bit, not just specifically about those things, but in terms of what we think about. In terms of your first question, we tend not to like it when there's the self-de-identification, when the person collecting the data is also doing the de-identification and then doing the analysis of that same de-identified data. Whether what you describe would be an exception to our generally not liking that may or may not be the case.
What you're saying is, even if I did that, that would get me to be able to submit as an exempt study. So it is human subjects research, because I am strapping sensors to people. I'm just taking a general guess, more for the people on the phone as well. People might be listening to this later about, do I have to worry? Don't think you're going to get out of this being human subjects research just on the basis that you're really studying the sensor, not the person. But if it is adequately de-identified, maybe you can get an exempt status.
But I would do something else. I would argue, is this really a systematic investigation?
So good.
I don't think picking 5 people that you know constitutes a systematic investigation if the research, unless the research question is about my friends, or the people, or some such but then it's not even a research question.
And unless we go back to, it's a research question about the device. And if we're saying this acoustic sensor functioned with this spectrum of efficiency with 5 different people, and we can generalize that the skin of those 5, was placed all in the same point. The skin of 5 people is generally the same. We can say the device is able to measure through the skin this level of voice detection, this level of electromyogram, this level of heart murmur, right? And we could publish that as data about the device.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't be able to publish it necessarily about data about any of those individuals
Or
about people.
Yeah.
But given what he said, John, are you saying you still might be able to argue, again, details, devil may be in details, we still argue this is not a systematic investigation. This is just such a early study, so simple in its design that it's not actually research, it's just a event.
As was pointed out in the presentation itself, there is no exception for pilot studies in the regulations. So a pilot study would require. So I remember one time getting a study in which there was going to be a subject population about 5. It was a subject population of about 5, but they submitted this IRB submission sort of as a model grant application that they hope to submit after they do the pilot study, and they had very broad aims, and the IRB rejected it because the design would not answer the question.
Yes.
So again, it might be that it constitutes human subjects research and it needs IRB review, but the methodology and the aims have to match. And if the methodology is 5 people and the aims are grandiose, it won't get an IRB approval.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What if the aims are as simple as just to show that it works in some people? Is that getting close to systematic and generalizable enough? I mean, generalizable, I guess, is there, but systematic enough, or is that just an IRB call?
That would be an IRB call.
So the hope
sort
is
of a temperature reading of the institution and the culture.
So the question is, so this seems to be applicable to a lot of student projects. They are so early that they're not, it is possible, let's say this, how about this as a take-home point, possibly. It is possible, and please help me if I get it wrong, John. Student projects may be at an early enough stage and be simple enough as beginning tests to be judged by a reasonable IRB as being not a systematic investigation, and therefore not research at all.
And we also need to define students. So we do approach it differently for graduate students than we do undergraduate students.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, but a classroom activity is generally not considered human subjects research. A honors thesis, a capstone project would.
Because of the quality of the study, that it becomes to look more and more systematic and like research. Whereas an undergraduate project, having written an undergraduate thesis, I now am aware, right?
Having read them,
that it basically wasn't even research. It wasn't just bad research. It wasn't even research.
Let alone a systematic investigation.
We philosophers have an argument over, is a child makes a radio. He does that by tying a string to a rock. Is that not a radio? Is it just a really bad radio? That's a Ruth Milligan example. And now it's been recorded. Okay.
Right. And I mean, one way that teams sometimes do this is that we are doing this as a pilot. We don't intend to publish this at all. We want to see if this works, and if we get something that we believe is now a device is now working, we will generate a protocol. We will collect the data systematically. We will have an adequate study that has the right aims and the right experimental methods, and we'll submit that.
But be careful also. The idea of whether you're going to publish or not publish has a lot of false positives and false negatives built into the answer. I mean, you can do QI and publish it as QI. Because you're telling us we did this at my institution and we changed the way we did X and it resulted in Y plus 3 as an outcome. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that it will do the same thing at your institution, but you might want to look at it.
Right.
Mary Ott is giving a treats talk this summer on quality improvement versus research. It's the first she's heard of it. Yeah, no, we've been chewing on that one a lot. When does quality improvement become research, and what exactly does this come down to? I have one more big. I want to go big here because it's ethics, and I do think this is really fascinating because again, we care so much about what the regulations are. We need to, but also some ethics questions around this. Especially, I love what you said about how so many students will graduate and go on to companies which will not be subject to common rule or IRB review. So you actually do want to teach them the ethics of doing research a certain way, even if it's not IRB supervised. And that's of course what we think here at BSAP, thinking about ethics. The other thing is that there's a fascinating idea. These facts about planning to publish and about systematicity, the risks to the subjects, are the same, whether or not there are 5 or 10 of them, and whether it's systematic enough to count as research or not. They're still strapping on a sensor which has the same risks to it. And it's always a funny thing that we treat these activities so differently. If it's 10 of them and it's systematic, then each subject has to consent and their risks have to be assessed by an independent board. But if it's only 5 of them and it's not systematic enough, they're facing the same risks, but now nobody reviewed it. And I guess that again, I guess the conclusion is that you just, the precepts of treating people fairly and nicely and protecting their health and their safety is important, whether or not you're under IRB review. But the fact of IRB review is a little, I will call it arbitrary, because it has to do with the thoughts in the mind of the person conducting it rather than the actual risk to the person participating. Does that fit?
Well, the definition is intended to contribute.
Right.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter if it's not. It doesn't matter if it's not a real contribution. If you intended to do so, it is.
Yep.
And then it works the other way as well.
Right.
Brilliant. More, Andrew, closing thoughts? Anybody else? Questions?
Well, I think sort of building on what John and Andrew said, as I've been thinking about this sort of issue of QI versus IRB, it really is quite striking because in the IRB, particularly, I mean, my realm of research is minimal risk with behavioral research. So if it's determined to be QI or a student project not determined, then there's like no requirements whatsoever. And if it's determined to be IRB, they have a consent form that's the same model consent that you use for like infusing poisonous chemotherapy into someone's cerebrospinal fluid. And so you have this sort of, but when you think about the ethics of it, really like the ethics are issues around consent. Does the person know what they're doing?
Right.
Are they aware of the procedures? Are they aware of any possible risks, which in behavioral research might be embarrassment or issues around privacy? And so thinking about like, even if it's something that's not in the IRB's purview in terms of where the new common rule falls, what are the obligations of the investigator in terms of making sure people are informed, making sure people understand that they can refuse this, making sure that they know sort of like what might potentially happen, even if it's nothing at all, like, with the looking at the vein thing, but, that this thing that you're wearing, it might record your conversation. When your girlfriend breaks up with you, or it's
You're wearing a damn sensor all the time.
So thinking about like what do we teach people, what sort of standards do we have for ourselves for when things end up as QI and research and non-research. I mean, I loved your little like 5-question thing, and I almost think that's like a whole class session where you sort of like, here's our 5 questions, but how do we work through one of these 5 question things?
Yeah, we'll post the recording of this and the 5-question form. It's on your slides. We'll post that as well. And actually, John, you had some forms you said you might have on assessing ethics of faculty conducting research and involved students. I don't know if there's some guidelines that, if there are such things that are up to date, we'll post that as well on the BSAP treats page. Any other burning questions here? Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop. It's noon.